Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. This is the second presentation in our four-part 2025 series, The Architecture of Transport in Britain. Today's lecture is entitled British Bridges of the 19th Century. The lecture will be presented by the noted art historian and television presenter, Daniel Cruickshank. Dan studied art, design, and architecture and was formerly a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. He was also a member of the London faculty of the University of Delaware. Dan serves as a member of the executive committee of the Georgian Group, a member of the architectural panel of the National Trust, and is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He's also served as historic buildings consultant for Adams Architecture and has been involved in the restoration of multiple historic buildings, including Spencer House in St. James's, Hevington Hall in Suffolk, and numerous early 18th century houses in Spitalfields and in other parts of London. Dan's professional publications include London, The Art of Georgian Building, the National Trust and Irish Georgian Society Guide to the Georgian Buildings of Britain and Ireland, and Life in the Georgian City. He has also served as a contributing editor to Architects Journal, the Architectural Review, and Perspectives on Architecture. Dan has written and presented numerous programs and series for the BBC and other networks, including the series Great Railway Adventures for National Geographic TV. The interlocutor for today's lecture is architectural writer, editor, and consultant Hugh Pearman. Hugh currently serves as a trustee and chairman of C20, the 20th Century Society. For 30 years, Hugh served as the architecture and design critic for the Sunday Times and has been a frequent contributor to numerous other publications, including The Guardian, The Observer, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. He also edited the RIBA Journal from 2006 to 2020. Hugh was an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He has served on the Art Council England's advisory group and chaired the Art for Architecture initiative at the Royal Society of Arts. He also serves on the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust. Hugh has served as a visiting professor of architecture at the Royal College of Art and is honorary vice president of the Architectural Association in London. Following Dan's lecture, Hugh will join him for further conversation. And now, it's my privilege to introduce Daniel Cruickshank.
If you're interested in 19th century engineering, and I assume you are, you would not be here, then I hope you enjoy this talk, because Britain's Victorian bridges, in particular its railway bridges, are among the most thrilling engineered structures in the world. Not just because they were pioneering structures on the cutting edge of the emerging age of fast, steam-powered communications, but because of the stories of the extraordinary people that made them. Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel, Robert Stephenson, and because of the stories the bridges themselves tell of triumphs over near impossible odds, harnessing nature to tame nature, and of tragedy. Before telling some of these stories, I must first make clear the fundamental themes I propose to explore. Most, of course, relate to 19th century British railway bridges, but I will, when appropriate, touch on other structures of the age in Britain and abroad. So, the themes: materials and means of construction and forms of construction. Most of the bridges I plan to discuss involve pioneering materials and structural techniques, but some will feature traditional materials used in a radically new manner. What is now astonishing is how brave and risky, perhaps sometimes reckless, engineers could be in the use of new materials and means of construction. In our age of risk aversion and health and safety, it seems incredible that unproven techniques were applied in the construction of major structures for public use. Usually, when it comes to railway bridges, this was driven by a sense of urgency, and by the demand of business in a most competitive environment. Bridge builders lived on the edge. The consequence, of course, was some famed calamities, which in turn led to lessons being quickly learned and applied, ensuring that development was rapid if risky. So it was an age of a quick, if at times dangerous, learning curve, empiricist, experiential approach to problem solving. I propose to tell the story in a simple manner through a short series of case studies arranged in roughly chronological order. But first, something of materials and means of construction. Materials were primarily cast iron, wrought iron, and then steel. The first two have been used in limited ways in construction for many years. In fact, wrought iron tie bars for centuries, but structural cast iron only since the 1790s. Steel does not have a long history of architectural use. But all were, in a sense, pioneering materials in the 19th century because of the increased scale and the novel manner of their use. Brick, stone, timber, and also concrete come into the story because new engineering knowledge allowed them to be used in new and bold ways. So the first image, Rain, Steam and Speed, J.M.W. Turner, 1841. It shows the Maidenhead Bridge of the Great Western Railway, completed by Brunel in 1839. Turner painted this because this bridge, as well as the locomotive, they were wonders of the age in the late 1830s, captured the public imagination. The widest span of this particular bridge is 128 feet, so that's wide at the time. The public was so alarmed by the width and shallowness of this brick-built arch that Brunel was obliged to initially leave the timber centering in place. The centering was a timber support he used to support the brick arch while it was being built. It was there for a year and then got swept away in a storm, and the bridge did not collapse. So, you know, again, this image is incredibly important to understand the excitement at the time that surrounded the creation of these great pieces of civil engineering and engineered structures. Concrete is very interesting. Initially, it's used for foundations at first, I say, but then reinforced with wrought iron and then with steel. It becomes an important material in bridge construction. Now, this next image is a Homersfield Bridge in the border of Norfolk and Suffolk, which is on the east side of England. It was built in 1869 to the design of an architect called Henry Ayton. A 50-foot span it comprises wrought iron reinforcing encased in concrete. It survives, although there is, of course, an inherent problem with concrete structure that reinforced with iron. Concrete can crack, water can penetrate, rust the iron frame, the iron frame expands, cracks get bigger, more water gets in, and so on. This bridge survives from 1869. So it's an interesting story, the whole kind of use of concrete in bridges. In the US, the English-born engineer Ernest L. Ransom designed steel reinforced bridges in concrete in San Francisco from 1889, the Alfred Lodge Bridge, a world first actually, and in the New York area from 1891, the Merkle Bridge on Shelter Island on the eastern end of Long Island. It also survives. Ransom's key innovation was to add a twist to steel reinforcing bars to improve the bond with the concrete. And if you look at steel reinforcing bars in use today, you will see they are twisted. So this is kind of a standard solution, comes from his time. The early application of this system is the world's first reinforced concrete skyscraper, 1903, the 15-story Ingallis building in Cincinnati, Ohio, architects Elsner and Anderson with engineer Henry Hooper. Concrete, economic to build and relatively fireproof. So concrete travels from bridges into the world of the skyscraper. In Scotland, there's this wonderful, sinuous and beautiful Glenfinnan Viaduct built in 1897 to 1901. Here it is. It is mass concrete poured over this would be steel, probably steel at this point. It should be this date. So mass concrete, 21 semicircular spans, each 50-foot wide. The whole structure stretches 416 yards. Concrete was used here because that was the only available really building material. The local stone shit was too hard to use. So this was a choice of material based on the economics and the nature of the site where this thing was being formed. What's interesting about this concrete is that it's poured, mixed with an aggregate into a timber formwork, resulting material strong in compression, but not strong in tension. So I'll come on to that in a moment. If you go to the next image, very interesting because it comes with it this form of construction, poured concrete into timber formwork. You see on the left-hand side that you can see the texture on the poured concrete formed by the board forming the formwork, the timber boards. A very direct and literal kind of expression of the concept, that the means of construction should be expressed in the architecture. This becomes very much a post-Second World War sort of hallmark of elements of modernism, Le Corbusier, for example, and what's now called brutalism. So, a handsome texture given to the concrete, but from the application of a form of construction. Interestingly, I love this building, this structure. It's unlikely in a sense for its date, I suppose, mass concrete, and in dramatic contrast with its setting, which to my mind reveals that modern industrial construction can at times add to natural beauty. Wonderful, the steam engine going across the concrete viaduct. So now let's think. The relation between materials and means of construction and design was a balancing act. The aim was to achieve speed and economy of construction and solidity, and of course, the required function of utility. And in bridge design, if not in viaduct design, near the top of the list of demands was almost invariably a maximum width of span between supports. Very fundamental structural requirement. Less support means the structure can be faster to build and cheaper to build. Piers are expensive, so get a big span. So for economics and functional reasons, this is jolly important. Work out how to span wide areas between supports. Now, let's look at some of the, and I suppose one should say, on that note, so all these elements I've mentioned were combined to achieve this ideal: wide spans, structures built solidly, quickly, and economically. So now let's look at some of the essential characteristics of some of the materials I've mentioned. Cast iron, strong in compression, but not in tension. So rather like mass concrete, while wrought iron and steel possess tensile strength. What this means, of course, is that cast iron is terrific carrying loads down vertically, but not great for horizontal loads, such as roof construction. So these different materials were suitable for different elements of a structure. Cast iron, I say, for vertical piers, for piers carrying loads down, wrought iron, or steel for ribs or arches. But it was soon apparent that it was best if these materials, with their differing structural characteristics, were combined to offer the best of both worlds. Metal reinforced concrete is an expression of this approach, I suppose, isn't it? As is Brunel's use of the brick and the Maidenhead Bridge. Brick is material strong in compression, but given additional strength by Brunel through well-calculated design. So the bridge's span possessed a scale usually only achieved by the use of material with great tensile strength, like wrought iron ribs. Another good example of the combination of materials with different structural characteristics is the Palm House in Kew Gardens in West London. It represents the emergence of wrought iron as a significant architectural material. The Palm House was built between 1844 and 1848 with the initial design by architect Decimus Burton, but ironmaster Richard Turner was the primary creative force. Externally, it's a very functional building, utilitarian building. It does the job it's meant to do, house great palms. in an atmosphere akin to the zones where they grow in nature. Outside, it's glazed. Inside, you will see cast iron, strong compression, used for columns. On the right, the cast iron column, combined with ribs of wrought iron for framing the glass or for supporting the structure. So here you see is wrought iron rib curving away to the left and on the other side too. So this combination of materials, and it achieves great beauty through the honest expression of function and materials, and the materials are used in a way that suits their nature. Such structures, including the best metal-built bridges, were in their design and construction a permutation of 1st century BC Roman architect Vitruvius's definition of good architecture as being a product of firmness, commodity, and delight, meaning that structural strength, when combined with fitness for purpose and functional elegance, lead to delight and beauty. In the railway age, this meant that a sound and functional structure would, by its nature, achieve a tough and utilitarian beauty. But at first, this beauty was ornamented by reference to historic styles, as was usual at the time. But by the 1850s, the modern idea started to emerge that when goodly materials and well-executed structural systems were honestly expressed, they would achieve beauty on their own terms. Now, this next image, the Firth of Forth Railway Bridge, just north of Edinburgh, is a clear example of this. It was designed by English engineers Sir John Fowler and Sir Benjamin Baker. Construction started in 1882 and was opened in March. The bridge opened in March 1890. It was designed on the cantilever principle, inspired by the skeletons of mammals. Natural history was a great influence at the time, with cantilevered sections linked by horizontal spans. The cantilever sections are the big trusses, and the spans are those horizontal portions that link those great trusses. This wonderful photograph from the 1890s demonstrates the structural principles of the balanced cantilevers of the railway, the Forth Bridge. Men right and left represent the trusses rising in the image behind them, their arms being in tension, and the sticks they hold in compression. The man in the center, there's one of a deerstalker cap, represents the load of a train passing over a suspended span. That is the suspended span behind him. The bridge has a total length of 894 feet. Its widest span measures 1,709 feet. All is built of steel, and there is no ornament beyond that of its massive and robust construction. The American architect, Louis Sullivan, offers some useful insights. Writing in 1892, he stated that it is self-evident that a structure, to quote Sullivan, quite devoid of ornament, may convey a noble and dignified sentiment by virtue of mass and proportion, and that it could be greatly for our aesthetic good if we should refrain entirely from the use of ornament and produce buildings that are comely in the nude. 4 years later, Sullivan expressed the essence of this aesthetic theory. I quote him again: "It is the pervading law of all things that form ever follows function. This is the law." So here is the simple truth. When form faithfully follows function, a powerful beauty is achieved. Arguably, this explains the visual power of such great bridges as that Firth of Forth, the old analogy, the old moral analogy between truth and beauty. An applied or superficial ornament, when it does not relate to structure or materials, becomes irrelevant. This theory was well established. A.W.M. Pugin, of aphorism of the 1840s, coined when he was promoting Gothic or pointed architecture, is appropriate. As Pugin wrote, All ornament should consist of enrichment of the essential construction of a building. It's this thing that was harmoniously conceived and well considered could be beautiful when it was part of the surface or substance that receives it rather than looking stuck on. This gets to the essence of the aesthetics of good bridge design. Now, into the brief case studies. Iron Bridge in Shropshire, on the border of England and Wales, crosses the River Severn. Started in 1777, opened in 1781, the first major bridge in the world made using cast iron as a structural material. Designed by an architect called Thomas Pritchard, constructed by ironmaster Abraham Darby III. Longest span, you see here, 100 feet. Recently repaired, it's painted this red. I suppose it's sort of against the rust, isn't it? It used to be stone color, previously black, but this is thought to be more or less the authentic color from the 1770s. 5 cast iron ribs, 1,700 individually cast components tailored to the locations rather than standard sizes. So this is not mass produced, as became common later on, although it's a mass production material cast iron, but the site is so specific, the geometry is so extraordinary that the components had to be made individually, and it's secured by these masonry abutments. Interestingly, the design and construction is based on carpentry timber bridges. The next slide will show this, I think, because you can see some of the here on the right-hand side, mortise and tenon joints, wedges and dovetails. So it's interesting. It's a kind of as one would imagine, the crossovers of technologies, the historic precedent of timber construction being applied initially to iron construction. The interlocking rings are interesting. You look at the center section. They make the trusses well. They connect the 5 arches to make it a truss arch bridge. So loads are being transferred one to the other. And Pritchard and Darby, of course, knew that cast iron works best in compression. So the structure is designed as far as possible to transmit loads vertically. So individual components are in compression. You just about see in this central image that there's these ogee-shaped cast iron arches, ogee-shaped, so concave, convex, a Gothic shape, really popular ornamental from the late Gothic period. It's an interesting example, I suppose, of Pugin's theory that ornaments should consist of enrichment of the central structure. Those components are central structure, but they're fashioned in an ornamental manner to create a sense of history, really. It's historical inspired ornament, bathing Gothic detail. The next image is interesting. Elias Martin, watercolor, 1779, shows the bridge under construction. Astonishing kind of image, isn't it, of a center, a proto-modern building. The image shows you in the center, you can see that the cast iron components are brought to site. They're made actually quite nearby by Abraham Darby. They're produced in Coalbrookdale nearby, delivered to site in the right sequence for assembly. They're presumably transported by water, such as this barge in the foreground. And you kind of see a derrick or pole on the left-hand side of the bridge lifting the arches into place. So it's a component structure, not mass-produced components, because they're mass-produced in a sense, but then they're tailored to the site, delivered to site, and produced, raised into position, wedged together by using these carpentry techniques and so on and so forth. Really very, very interesting. So the next image is Southwark Bridge, the City of London. An astonishing bridge as a private toll bridge. With interesting, the Thames was crossed. This is right connecting the city, the ancient City of London, on the north bank with the south bank here. We're on the south bank looking towards the city churches. A private toll bridge. It was a speculation. It was a business venture. You build a bridge and then try and make money by charging people to cross it. That's another whole fascinating story. It didn't really ever work quite well. These bridges were often quite deserted because people would choose other bridges that are often free to cross. Never mind. An act of Parliament in 1811 gave the developers power to build this bridge, constructed 1814 to 1819, designed by the great John Rennie, one of the great engineer architects in Britain operating in the early 19th century. Had 3 spans of cast iron rising from granite piers. So, as I mentioned before, spans are important, wide spans. These are the widest spans ever achieved with cast iron, as it happens. So he crossed the Thames and the roads each side in 3 spans. Only 2 piers were needed. That was a big deal at the time. And the spans worked. Cast iron, I say, strong in compression, but these obviously have a lot of horizontal loads. But it was well calculated. It did not fail. The bridge lasted for 100 years. Its narrow width proved its undoing in the end, that there were not structural failures. So a really, really interesting example of a successful cast iron bridge. They were not all successful. As I mentioned before, these epoch-making calamities. But being the 19th century and engineers being robust, people, they didn't collapse. Generally, they learned from the disasters and improved their designs. Here we see the Dee Bridge disaster illustrated in a publication in the mid-1840s. It was in Cheshire, designed by Robert Stephenson, one of the great heroes of the 19th century railway age. His father, George Stephenson, had been a pioneer of the design of locomotives. In the 1840s, his son was one of the big figures in the industrial age, particularly in bridge design and in railway design generally. But Stephenson did not, it seems, fully grasp the structural limitations of cast iron. It was a new material, and one can understand that. This bridge, a railway bridge, obviously, you see from the debris it was carrying a railway when this disaster took place, railway carriages. It was made from cast iron girders of I section profile, so like the capital letter I, with the larger flange at the bottom to support the timber sleepers on which the track was placed. A nice idea, you know, designing this I section, so it has a double function, carries the spans and also supports the decking for the tracks. Each girder was formed of 3 sections dovetailed together. Each was 100 feet in span. They're quite a big span, 100-foot span for each of these girders. Stephenson used cast iron because it was cheap and quick to produce and immensely strong when used correctly. But in recognition of the tensile limitations of cast iron, Stephenson reinforced each of the girders with wrought iron ties running along their length. Seemed a straightforward and effective solution, but Stephenson was wrong. On the 24th of May, 1847, part of one of the bridge's cast iron girders broke while a train was passing across, leading to a partial collapse and to the locomotive and carriages plunging into the water. 5 people were killed and 9 injured. Here is the image of what happened. There was a national outcry, much press interest. Many publications like this were circulated. This revolutionary material and novel design had failed catastrophically. Why had this happened? Of course, an inquiry followed. Close studies of the bridge revealed that the cast iron beams deflected alarmingly when a train passed over, and that the wrought iron bars, rather than helping, made things worse by imposing severe local stresses on parts of the bridge. Stephenson struggled to save his reputation by suggesting that the engine had by chance derailed when crossing the bridge and had hit and damaged the structure. There was no evidence to support this, and many witnesses denied it. The fault was with design, and in part because a few days earlier, Stephenson had ordered heavy track ballast, stones and such like things, to be laid next to the rails to protect the timber decking from burning coals falling from the trains passing over, locomotives passing over. A timber-made bridge designed by Brunel near Uxbridge in the west end of London had recently been badly damaged in this way. So a massive extra weight had been added to the structure. Eventually, the coroner's jury concluded that, quote, the girder did not break from any lateral blow from the engine, but from it being made of a strength insufficient to bear the pressure of quick trains passing over it. No girder bridge of so brittle and treacherous a metal as cast iron alone, even though trussed with wrought iron rods, is safe for quick or passenger trains. While the reputation of Robert Stephenson was being severely challenged by the partial and fatal collapse of the Dee Bridge, he was working on the construction of the high-level bridge in Newcastle that also made much use of cast iron. Design work had got underway in 1845. It must have been 1847, a highly stressful time for all involved. Cast iron under the microscope seemed to have failed, partly due to the design of the engineer, of the architect of this bridge, Stephenson. What was to be done? The bridge is sensational, by the way, the high-level bridge in Newcastle. Cities of bridges. New York's a city of bridges. Newcastle is a city of bridges. You travel from south to north and north to south over the Tyne through the centre of Newcastle. You're given a display of the most sensational bridges, 19th and 20th century bridges in a row, all telling different stories. This bridge is a two-tier bridge, so it's vehicles and pedestrians. The lower level, the top trains. This two-tier bridge becomes a standard solution. Several examples, of course, in New York, they're much later. The Washington Bridge is the 1920s, I think. But here is this principle. High level because the railway comes in at a higher level than the surrounding streets. So these massive piers are built and the trains sail through the city. The promoter of this bridge was a man called George Hudson, the railway king, an amazing character. Eventually became bankrupt and revealed to be a fraud, but that's again another story. It was to be the engineering showpiece of the route Hudson was promoting, connecting London and Edinburgh. Total length of 1,337 feet and rose 120 feet above high water level on the Tyne. You can see the drama of the creation. I love the image on the right, early 20th century, I suppose, showing it looming over these 17th, 18th century warehouses and houses on the banks of the river. A tremendous image of the drama of railway engineering in terms of the aesthetics and the scale and materials. Cast iron was used to form the frame of the two-tier spans, each 38 meters long. And you see in this image how they work. Most of this is cast iron. The arch is cast iron, but it's restrained. It's a tied arch. It's a bowstring arch. It's restrained by a horizontal tie, which of wrought iron, which connects the ends of each arch. So that is simply because the arches are very strong, but they have a lateral push outwards, and they could topple the piers, but the wrought iron tie bar anchors the ends of the arches and means to do not press outwards. And cast iron is okay here because the weight of the trains above the crown of the arch means it's operating in compression. This is where you see one of the examples. So the bowstring arch, there's the arch, cast iron, in compression, the weight of the trains on the top, and you can't see it, but the ends of the arch are tied. So stop it spreading and stop it exerting outward thrust on the masonry piers each side. Well, it's a beautiful thing to experience, to visit. If you ever in England have time in your hands, go to Newcastle. You walk through this tremendous wonderland of mid-19th century engineering. You see some of the details. I think the next image gives you it's a little hint of what you see. So the lower, on the left-hand side, you're walking along the pedestrian route and the vehicle route. Above you are the trains. All that is it's cast iron. these wonderful X-frames, again cast iron, and on the right is one of the arches, again cast iron, but with these ends tied with raw iron. The bridge opened in 1849, and all was well. The lessons had been learned from the Dee Bridge, and this design worked. Combination of cast iron and wrought iron, and it carried the loads and continued to this day. Interestingly, the next bridge, the Britannia Railway Bridge, crosses the Menai in North Wales. Fascinating, Menai, North Wales, also by Robert Stephenson, but the engineer of great genius called William Fairbairn. April 1846, the foundation then was laid. So that's before the Newcastle Bridge was opened. But here, Stephenson with Fairbairn had moved on from cast iron to wrought iron, mainly due to Fairbairn. The solution here was to create this vast wrought iron tube. So here you see the approach to the bridge. Interesting about the use of history, although these great bridges tend to, well, roughly at this date, abandon reference to historic styles. You see here clearly this is kind of inspiring Egypt and Rome, isn't it? These great porticos, these lions, and the piers have an Egyptian quality. So this is, late 1840s, 50s, still the deference to the pedigree of history coming into this bridge design. All this changes in this decade, between 1850 and 1860. Those sort of familiar references to historic styles disappear, but this is still clearly part of its aesthetic, is to evoke these great and glorious structures from the ancient world, Egypt and Rome. Brilliant. I love the steam engine coming out of the tunnel. I say tunnel, that's what it's like, this tremendous bridge, a high level of amazing landscape. You get no view from it because what you do, you're emptying a wrought iron tunnel. This is Fairbairn's idea. So wrought iron, strong in tension, replacing cast iron as a primary building material. Interestingly, these tunnels are formed of plates of wrought iron riveted together. So, and that technique was derived from contemporary shipbuilding practices, partly because Fairbairn was also a shipbuilder. So it's a wonderful example of sort of transfer technology, which becomes very big in 20th century architecture, I suppose, of taking technologies from one form of manufacture to another. And so this is sort of shipbuilding techniques used in pioneering metal ships being built at the time, applied to railway architecture. Interestingly, when this, if you can maybe the next image, you see this tube going across. So one of the problems identified from the start was that the top element of these wrought iron, I say tubes, like these boxes, aren't they? Covered boxes, that the top element could buckle under its own weight. And so Fairbairn had to come up with a solution, very, as inspired engineers do. He made a design of corrugated tubes to support the top element of what I call the tube, this sort of square section tunnel. And that worked. In 1850, the bridge was complete, opened in March 1850. And in broad terms, it marks the great shift in bridge design, or major bridge design, from cast iron to wrought iron. So it's one of the great bridges of the world. It captures a transitional moment in bridge design. And I'll say why in a moment. This is the Royal Albert Bridge, Saltash, Cornwall, on the border between Cornwall and Devon in the southwest of Britain, over the River Tamar, for the Great Western Railway, which was the great, in a sense, Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel's great opportunity to demonstrate his ability and the potential of railways. This railway system went from London, Paddington to Bristol, and further west to Cornwall, and also from Bristol, the notion of having these great iron-built ships taking passengers from Bristol to New York. So steam, coal-fired steam and metal created an international transport system. This is beyond Bristol. This is going west, but part of the Great Western Railway. Opened in 1859, Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel. Just look at it. It is an amazing object, is it not? At high level again, the spans are wide. That was the idea. Each span is 455 feet, so not many piers are needed. The piers were a huge problem constructing them. Constructing piers like that involves a whole parallel technology of how you build large piers on river beds, and there were coffer dams created. How do you keep the water out? You pump the water full of air. Pneumatic caissons, they were used later on for the construction of Brooklyn Bridge, famously in New York in the 1870s. They're terrifying. It's a terrifying solution that the compressed air keeps the water out. That creates for human beings an impossible atmosphere. We now know it as the bends, but when you come out of that atmosphere, you can have catastrophic consequences on your body. People died in great pain, and no one quite knew what was going on at the time. Caisson disease, it was called, but it was basically what's now called the bends when you ascend as a diver from too great a depth. So, you know, it was difficult to build such things. He didn't want to build many of them, expensive and frightening and lethal for some people. So what Brunel comes up with is his very wide spans. And you see the illustration at the bottom, you see how it works. A tube at the top, not unlike the spans on the high level bridge at Newcastle. At the top is a great tube of wrought iron. Here you see it. And its ends are tied by a chain of wrought iron. So again, the arch gives great strength and allows a wide span. But of course, the arches always have this lateral push out, so as in the Newcastle Bridge, that is restrained by tying the ends of the arch by an inverted arch, ends of the top arch with an inverted arch. That's just the outward thrust. We get interesting also the use of history. There's kind of those pylons are kind of Egyptian, but generally speaking, of course, this is the great moment, anticipating the fourth bridge, where the structure, the materials are their expression of them. The glory of the engineering triumph is the ornament. No other ornament is necessary. These are called, by the way, lenticular trusses, that look like lentils. So these massive tubular arches. It's an incredible thing. It's 100 feet above water level. I say that the building that the caissons was a terrific exercise. And Brunel, towards the end of his life, this is the year of his death, I think, when it's opened. He's brought here to see it lying on the bed of a carriage being carried across this great bridge. It's his last great moment as an engineer. A glorious construction that is, I say, the epitome, I suppose, of 19th century bridge design. The glory of his engineering and of his materials exposed, and they need no other form of ornamentation apart from being themselves. Now, talking about the cutting edge and living on the edge, and the lessons being learned and calamities often being the consequence of the speed of the construction process, I have to mention the Tay Bridge. Despite the collapse of the Dee Bridge in the 1840s, still lessons to learn. This is an amazing story. This bridge combined, you see, spans of different types, been designed by a chap called Sir Thomas Bouche. Construction started in 1871. He used wrought iron lattice girders and cross bracing combined with cast iron columns. Fair enough. Cast iron for the columns, good in compression. It stretched nearly 2 miles. It was the longest bridge in the world at the time. And the engineer, Bouche, was much celebrated. Indeed, he was knighted by Queen Victoria in June 1879 when she crossed the bridge. It was, again, one of the wonders of the world, displaying British, Scottish prowess in engineering. That was in June. In December 1879, calamity. during a violent gale, and while a train was passing over, the bridge suffered a partial collapse. You can see the missing portion of the bridge. This is documenting the consequence of the calamity a few months after it happened. This must be early in 1880, this photograph. Partial collapse. Locomotive and carriages fell into the freezing water. At least 60 people are known to have died. At the time, it was thought to be far more. 90 people were assumed to have died. People had got on or off. No one quite knew who was on it. And so the death toll was thought to be high as 90. Again, national lamentation, national horror. Images are published there. People fell into the freezing water. The photograph on the right is very solemn, isn't it? Just after the collapse of the portion of the collapsed bridge lying in the now still waters. It transpired that Bush had made no explicit allowance for wind loading in the design of the bridge. Again, lessons to be learned. Nor had he considered the extra surface area offered to the wind by the presence of a train on the bridge. There are other flaws in detailed design, in maintenance, and in quality control of iron castings, all of which were, at least in part, the engineer's responsibility. Indeed, he died less than a year after the disaster, his reputation, of course, ruined. The Court of Inquiry concluded in its report, the fall of the bridge was occasioned by the insufficiency of the cross bracing and its fastenings to sustain the force of the gale. It indicated that if the piers, and in particular wind bracing, had been properly constructed and maintained, the bridge could have withstood the storm that night, albeit with a low factor of safety. So a failure of design and interesting of maintenance and quality control. Obviously, speed and money had been an issue. However, this disaster did produce a masterpiece of a kind, arguably the most ungainly poem in the English language. I better read a bit to you. You will expect me to, I suppose. Any of you know the Tay Bridge disaster by a man called William McGonagall, a poet in the 1880s. A few of the verses. Beautiful railway bridge over the silvery Tay. Alas, I am sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. So the train moved slowly along the bridge of Tay until it was about midway. Then the central girders with the crash gave way, and down went the train and the passengers into the Tay. The storm fiend did loudly bray, because 90 lives had been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. Well, he was right about that. It is remembered. Now, my last bridge is a final note, I suppose, on bridge design that went against the evolving principles and tastes of bridge design at the time in the 1880s. If you can define those, looking at, say, the Forth Bridge, the emerging conviction that materials and means of construction should be honestly expressed, and that superficial and history-inspired ornament should be greatly reduced. I mean, you see it at Brunel's Saltash Bridge, of course, the Forth Railway Bridge. Also raised other issues about the meaning of bridges. You know, bridges are fascinating because they are expressions of man's ability to tame nature by using the laws of nature, physics, by creating objects that seem to defy the forces of nature, and often in themselves become almost elements of natural forces, a man-made nature in the face of nature. Bridges are fascinating in their complexities, in the emotions they arouse, the fact they are bridges between things, between places, between ideas, and often in that respect, they create memorable images and give a sense of pride to people. So I'll get on to that a little bit in a moment about this bridge. So Tower Bridge. Okay, in the late 19th century, the City of London, remember City of London? From Roman times, you could say it was founded perhaps before that, 2,000 years old. It sits on the banks of the Thames where the Romans created their great trading city. They invaded Britannia in 40 AD. So between the Tower of London, built after Norman invaders in 1066, east to, say, St. Paul's Cathedral, roughly in the west, the square mile. The City of London still is a self-governing body, and in the late 9th century, it was determined to create a new river crossing near the estuary of the Thames to better connect the City of London, with its financial institutions and merchant life, with the docks industrial area to the south of the Thames, rapidly expanding. So a new crossing was needed. But the city also wanted to retain access for tall masted trade ships to the old Pool of London, which was kind of the Roman area, just to the east of London Bridge. London Bridge is just to the west, where Tower Bridge was built. So this was important. So the new bridge had to be capable of being open to allow these tall masted ships, many of them Yankee ships, they were coming in to the London docks. So this was the brief. And the only possible site that could be used was indeed next to the Tower of London, an available site whose historic character had to be protected. And Queen Victoria, the owner of the Tower of London, was vociferous. She was demanding that this new bridge had to respect and not diminish or in any way insult the historic architecture presence of the Tower of London, dating, of course, from the 11th century. So the city architect, a man called Horace Jones, eventually won the commission. There was a competition. He won it. Another story how he managed to do that. He did. Work started in 1886 and was completed in 1894. The bridge is a combined bascule and suspension bridge. The bascules are the center portion of the bridge that opens like a drawbridge, originally powered hydraulically by steam engines with counterweights that descend into these huge chambers below the towers. The towers are functionally necessary because they provide anchors for the flanking suspension portions of the bridge. You see them each side. And they were they also had this gantry at the top, which allowed pedestrians to go across the bridge when the road itself was raised. As these images are showing you, it's a fascinating construction. The towers are steel framed. They're modern steel frames, like the tower being built in Chicago and New York by people like Burnham and Root in the 1890s. Steel is now the material, a steel frame construction, very modern, very strong, very efficient steel frame construction, but it had to be decorated. So you're going back to the earlier concept. And here the steel frame is not expressed and made glorious as an expression of the modern age and ingenious construction, but it's clad with granite and historic style, which is sort of Tudor Gothic. That is the late Gothic of the, I suppose, late 16th century, 16th century. These pictures are fantastic. You get this kind of emergence of this entirely modern structure. Then it's clad in granite with historic detailing. If you go to the next image, what's the working drawings from the time you see the one on the left inside the staircase? All that's a steel frame, and then literally just clad with historic detail. What's interesting about this bridge is artistically odd, perhaps, and retrograde, you may think, but the public loved it, and the public still do. And this gets me on to that point I was making a moment earlier about the meaning and power of bridges. If you think of the next image will show you the comparison. Okay, here they are together. Tower Bridge with the bascules opened, a glorious image, incredibly ornamental, and of course, it's a fake, it's a fraud. If you ask people, as I have done, tourists who go to walk at it and love it, how old they think it's very old, 400-500 years. It's convincing in its fakery. It's beautifully done, but it is not an expression of its age, or it's an expression of an aspect of its age, I suppose. On the right, the fourth is brutally, beautifully honest. Form, structure, materials become the great ornament. What's interesting to me is that both these bridges illustrate the role bridges have in placemaking, in connecting communities, opening up areas and creating new prospects. And they have become symbols and images that define a location. The Tower Bridge in many ways is the image of London. The Forth Bridge is the image of Scotland. And you will find bridges around the world where things are comparable. They are such glorious and important constructions. They occupy such a powerful place in the imagination of people that they become the symbols of a location. The Brooklyn Bridge in New York, many people think that, and is an image of the city and was in a way calculated to be that. In the 1870s or 1880s, when it was being completed by the road bridge, it's another fantastic story. It was to be the epitome of the spirit of the place. So you have Tower Bridge, Brooklyn Bridge, Firth of Forth. These are great bridges, all very different, but they remind us of the power of the bridge as an engineered construction and as an image and as a symbol and as an object that gives pride and identity to different generations of people. Thank you very much.
I was really taken. Thanks very much for that, Dan. And we're having a fireside chat here now about it.
Brandy.
So good to meet you in person to do this. This is really great. One of the things that struck me about that, particularly when you're talking about, from Louis Sullivan onwards, the nude structure.
Yes.
That's all it needs. That is expression enough. When I look at some of those bridges, I think, that resurfaced in architecture, particularly in the UK, particularly from the 1970s. And could you talk a bit about that? How that engineering tradition then later, well over a century later, almost 150 years later, started to inspire
the high-tech stuff.
The high-tech style, yes.
Well, that's a very interesting one, isn't it? When technology becomes the driving force, and also the transference of technology. If you think about Boberg and Lloyd's earlier structures, literally taking technologies from other production systems and applying them to architecture. But then there's another layer of that, isn't there? The kind of almost rebellious, the Dadaist thing of kind of compositions using components that you like a collage. It's a very fascinating connection, of course, with engineering, because of engineered bridges, because of course you're creating buildings which have their own aesthetic, their own ornament, but it's not derived from any other sort of aesthetic ornament. It derives from the creative process of that particular building. So definitely the bridges are an inspiration for that.
And I think there's a neoclassical architect, Robert Adam, who observed that
the current Robert Adam.
The current Robert Adam, not the 18th century Robert Adam, whose work is, of course, very much in the British Architectural Library. Who observed that high tech, as that style emerged at that time in Britain, was in a way, and in some buildings, for instance, with Lloyd's of London, that great insurance headquarters in the City of London, for instance, and other of those Richard Rogers buildings, structure being used very much in a decorative sense.
Well, it's true, of course.
Of course it's true. And to me, people disagree about this, but to me, Lloyd's of London is every bit as much of a postmodern building.
I couldn't agree more. It's very constructed, and it has an expression of pure function. Third, obviously, the lifts. There's a very good reason why lifts are not outside buildings. They don't work. And Lloyd's, as you go to look at it now, has been a big struggle to make the lifts work. They're covered in gunge and grease and so on and so forth. It's quite a good reason why they're covered, as the Rogers building opposite is the case. And also, the making of the components, they're beautifully made. They're crafted like a Gothic building. And they're not just components of doing a function, they are ornamental. But that's not surprising, because it has there's a tremendous sense of aesthetics about it.
So that craft of casting very much spanned the century, really, and re-emerged in the struts and the cross bracing and everything else like that. But going back a whole lot further to that wonderful little first cast iron bridge at Iron Bridge in Shropshire. And what fascinated me about that was the way you showed us the carpentry details of that bridge. And that, to me, is delightful in architectural terms, because that brings us to the subject of the skeuomorph. The skeuomorph being an object which, in a sense, apes the materials of an earlier time. I suppose that's one way of putting it. There are various other descriptions of a skeuomorph, but that bridge does that because we're looking at people using new materials in an old-fashioned way. They could almost have made that bridge out of 2x4 lengths of timber if they wanted. That I find interesting because that puts it in the same bracket as, for instance, the Parthenon, famously, obviously, a stone building based on timber, the notion of columns of timber. So, but that's also what you showed in that in that talk is that very interesting ending with Tower Bridge there, Tower Bridge and the Forth Bridge. The notion that even though these engineers and architects were working with new materials and in new forms, they still, in many cases, felt the need to have just a little bit of historical detail on it.
I mean, I wasn't, I suppose, quite. Tower Bridge is obviously curious because of the demands put upon the engineer. I mean, I mentioned laughingly Queen Victoria. That was a big deal.
Oh, yes.
You know, her and her advisor were insistent that the new bridge had to be historical, and that was it. So basically, there wasn't an opportunity to do a further Forth. I mean, in the competition, which was a massive affair, many people submitted design before Horace Jones won it. The city architect wins it. Wow. There are radical designs,
yes,
which are not historical, but they didn't.
And yet,
have,
there's other things exactly. And yet there were other things lurking at the edges. You mentioned Brunel, and it wasn't only Brunel, I think, in what you showed, the Egyptian craze.
Well, Clifton suspension. Clifton's fascinating. I could have shown it, but Clifton's a good odd one because
that is a bridge which spans the River Avon in Bristol. That's a vehicle bridge, not a railway bridge. Look it up. It's a suspension bridge, but yes, those Egyptian portals.
That's right, because if you remember the story, he wins a competition when he's young, and the building is not completed until his death. I mean, the towers are built, but the spans are not, and the designs he produced for those the towers which are there are entirely Egyptian. Detailed by him is Egyptian. That they're more abstract when built. Brunel's fascinating, talking about kind of Iron Bridge traditional building techniques applied in a new material, but also something like Brunel personifies that because his bridges are radical. His great roof at Paddington, 1850, just after the Great Exhibition, 1851, a lot of wrought iron, a lot of glass, some historical detail, but generally breathtaking modern construction. But in parallel, he's making these modern designs, Saltash, radical, I'd say. But his architecture, his smaller buildings, his station buildings, are purely historicist. He's a Regency buck in many ways, So his little stations are Bath, the Jacobean and classical. So he's an interesting character. These people like Brunel, these parallel characters, they occupy parallel artistic worlds simultaneously.
And even as we were up in Scotland, we're at the Tay. And by the way, what a joy to listen to the William McGonagall, the poet of Great Doggerel. How many different ways can you find to rhyme with the word Tay? So that's always actually it's a hilarious riposte to an absolute national tragedy. That was one of the strange things about McGonagall. He didn't realize he was funny at all. Of course, he meant it completely seriously. So there was that. But and then finally, I suppose from me on this comes what you touched on, which is that idea of the bridge as a place, a place which, as they were designed, they were obviously just getting from A to B. And that's why I'm always amused by those two Stephenson bridges, the one wonderful double-decker one approaching at high level across Newcastle, where you see the whole 5 to 7 bridges across the Tyne there, and then the one which, as you say, was a tunnel in the air. So again, high level, amazing views all around. Can't see any of them. You're in a tunnel. So they were not particularly. It seems to me, I suppose, I'm asking the question really: were they ever aware, particularly, of the picturesque, the scenic quality of what they were doing?
Undoubtedly. I mean, a couple of years ago, more like 10, I read a book about bridges, which part of this is based on. So I did a lot of research about the power of the bridge, the stories it tells, and also about that aspect of how they were perceived. And the picturesque movement in the late 18th, early 19th century, which this is all taking place within that picturesque, the landscape movement and so on. Canal and roads were made. It was undoubtedly roads were often located in positions, particularly say the Welsh countryside, with a thought to the picturesque effect, how they could offer views, how they could be perceived, and bridges would have been a thought, part of the thought process. Not the positioning of them, because that's normally just ruthlessly dictated by getting the levels, and the quickest way between A and B. But the presence of a structure in a landscape was definitely considered by these engineers.
Well, I think we'll end it there. Dan Cruickshank, thanks very much for sharing your talk on bridges, and especially railway bridges.
I frankly just wanted to thank Dan and you for what has been an extremely interesting program. To me, a fascinating subject. While we still have everyone on board, I'd also like to remind everyone of the topic and date of the next lecture in this series, St. Pancras Transformed, the story of Britain's greatest railway building, which will, I think, be a very fascinating lecture. It will be presented on Thursday, March 20th, and our speaker will be Simon Bradley, and Hugh Pearman again will serve as our interlocutor. Reminding everyone that information on the British Architectural Library Trust, its activities and programs, and the other upcoming lectures in this series and other activities can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.